Ladies and gentlemen, imagine Africa as one giant theater stage where the actors are not trained professionals but accidental revolutionaries, failed Marxist poets, Cold War mascots, and self-proclaimed kings who never saw a throne they didn't want to steal. Every one of them walked on stage with the script of Liberator in hand, only to tear it up halfway through and improvise as tyrants. And the plot twist? Every single one of them eventually fell, sometimes gracefully, sometimes in humiliating flames. From Mobutu's leopard head tumbling into exile, to Mengistu sneaking away like a thief in the night, to Charles Taylor swapping a presidential palace for a jail cell in The Hague, to Gaddafi dragged from a drainpipe like a drowned rat, to Mugabe finally learning that even lions die of old age. This is the chronicle of how dictators fall in Africa. It is not a happy story, nor a sad one. It is a theater, grotesque and absurd, with an audience that stretches from Kinshasa to Washington to London to the entire African diaspora, scrolling on their phones thinking, my God, not again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part 1 of our series, How Africa's Most Feared Dictators Finally Fail. Let's start with the peacock of dictators, Mobutu Sese Seko. If arrogance had a designer brand, Mobutu would have been its ambassador. He wore a leopard-skin hat as if it were a crown, built himself palaces in the jungle, and renamed his country Zaire as though geography were his personal Lego set. For over 3 decades, he ran Zaire like a mafia state, stealing billions of dollars while his people queued for soap. But here is the punchline. He was Washington and Paris' favorite pet. Why? Because during the Cold War, he pretended to hate the communists. And that was enough. Forget democracy, forget human rights. The Americans and French only wanted a loyal puppet to block Soviet influence. Mobutu delivered, and in return, he got Concorde flights to Paris to shop for suits, Swiss bank accounts, fattened by mining revenues, and the false sense of immortality every dictator loves to inhale. But history, like a jealous lover, always comes back to collect. By the 1990s, the Cold War ended. Uncle Sam no longer needed a corrupt leopard in Kinshasa. He was suddenly bad PR. Meanwhile, civil war erupted as Rwanda's genocide spilled into eastern Zaire. Enter Laurent Kabila, a rebel who had been forgotten for decades, suddenly reborn thanks to Rwandan and Ugandan backing. His ragtag soldiers, dressed more like farmers than fighters, marched across Zaire as if the army were made of cardboard. And Mobutu, the once almighty, cancer-ridden dictator, discovered that when the foreign money dries up, the generals who saluted yesterday disappear today. In 1997, Kabila's men reached Kinshasa and Mobutu fled. His leopard head pegged in shame, his Swiss accounts frozen, his name cursed. He died a few months later in Morocco, not as an emperor, but as a tragic clown. Africans cheered, Westerners looked away and pretending they hadn't created him, and the diaspora sighed. Yet another strongman gone, but the system remained. This expose serves to remind all the leaders in Africa that if you live your democratic rule, no matter how many years you are in power, you will still be removed, either by the people or by an act of God. And then there was Mengistu Haile Mariam, Ethiopia's master of terror. This man had the charisma of a coffin salesman and the ruthlessness of a butcher. When he and his Deg junta overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, the world thought Ethiopia had entered a new dawn. Instead, it entered hell. Mengistu launched mass executions, filling Addis Ababa with corpses, while pretending it was all in the name of socialism. He took food from starving peasants to feed his army, triggering famines so horrific that Western charities made entire careers out of saving Ethiopia. And who bankrolled him? The Soviet Union, of course. Moscow sent him guns, tanks, and Cuban troops because in the chessboard of the Cold War, starving Ethiopians were acceptable pawns. For years, Mengistu survived, not by feeding his people, but by feeding ideology to his masters in Moscow. But the empires collapsed, and when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics disintegrated, Mengistu's lifeline snapped. By the late 1980s, rebels from Eritrea and Tigray pushed deeper into Ethiopian territory. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front advanced on Addis like a tide that could not be stopped. And Mengistu, the brave revolutionary, boarded a plane and vanished. Where did he go? To Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe rolled out the red carpet. Today, Mengistu still lives in Harare, enjoying his tea while his victims lie in unmarked graves. Africans learned that even ideological monsters eventually run out of excuses. The diaspora watched and muttered. Same play, different actor. And Westerners who once funded him or his enemies, depending on the decade, shrugged, moving on to the next proxy war. Liberia, however, was too chaotic even for proxy war logic. In 1980, Samuel Doe seized power by storming the presidential palace. He was hailed as the first indigenous leader to overthrow Americo-Liberian elites, but his victory quickly turned into tragedy. Doe ruled like a thug with a tribal army, stealing money, torturing opponents, and destroying whatever fragile state Liberia had. His end was straight out of a horror movie. When Charles Taylor launched a rebellion in 1989, Liberia collapsed into civil war. Doe was captured in 1990 by Prince Johnson's forces. And here's where the nightmare turned surreal. Johnson filmed himself calmly drinking beer while Doe was being tortured. A dictator's downfall broadcast like a snuff film. To this day, that footage circulates as one of Africa's most grotesque chapters. But the carousel didn't stop spinning. Charles Taylor, the man who lit the country on fire, then ran for president in 1997. His slogan, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." Fear disguised as democracy. Taylor won and ruled with diamonds soaked in blood, and expanded war into Sierra Leone by trading arms for blood diamonds. Eventually, even the world had enough. In 2003, rebels cornered him, US warships appeared off Liberia's coast, and Taylor realized he wasn't the biblical king he imagined. He fled into exile, then ended up in The Hague, convicted of war crimes. His prison cell today is the final stage prop in Liberia's bloody theater. Africans saw the moral. Dictators don't just fall, they drag nations with them. The diaspora saw family trees destroyed. Americans and Europeans saw diamonds that they once bought stained with blood. And then Gaddafi, the self-styled brother leader who ruled Libya for 42 years with a blend of clownish theatrics and brutal repression. One day he was funding liberation movements, the next he was hosting beauty pageants, and in between he wrote the bizarre Green Book, a manual that made less sense than a drunk uncle's speech. He wanted a United States of Africa with himself as president because of course he did. To Western powers, he was a terrorist sponsor, implicated in the Lockerbie bombing. Later, he reinvented himself as an ally against terrorism. He was unpredictable, theatrical, and insane enough to believe he could outlive time itself. But 2011 was his curtain call. The Arab Spring reached Libya and Gaddafi vowed to crush it alley by alley, house by house. The rebellion spread. NATO intervened and his army collapsed. In October, cornered, Gaddafi was found hiding in a drain pipe. The man who once called himself the King of Kings of Africa died begging for mercy, beaten and shot by rebels. His corpse was paraded on a truck, the final humiliation of a man who once entertained monarchs. Africans were torn between relief and chaos because Libya collapsed into a warlord's paradise. Westerners congratulated themselves on ending tyranny while conveniently ignoring the anarchy they left behind. The diaspora looked on, shaking their heads, another dictator gone, another nation ruined. Finally, Robert Mugabe, the Shakespearean figure of Southern Africa. In 1980, he was a liberation hero, the teacher turned statesman who promised reconciliation after independence. But heroes make terrible dictators. Over time, Mugabe turned land reform into a scorched earth policy, crushed dissent and destroyed Zimbabwe's economy. Hyperinflation made money cheaper than toilet paper, yet Mugabe still strutted as if he were the chosen king. He declared he would rule until he was 100, and many believed him because the man was stubborn beyond biology. But in 2017, his arrogance caught up with him. When he tried to hand power to his wife Grace, the army that had always propped him up decided to flip the script. Tanks rolled into Harare, the old lion trapped in his own palace. Crowds flooded the streets cheering, thinking liberation had finally come again. But in reality, it was a coup wrapped in confetti. Mugabe resigned, not because the people's voices finally roared louder than the state, but because his comrades wanted him gone. His replacement, Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, was the crocodile in waiting, a continuation, not a revolution. Africans danced, but then woke up to the same system in a new mask. The diaspora sighed déjà vu. Westerners applauded, democracy returning, proving once again that they can't tell a costume change from real reform. So, what do these stories teach us? They show that dictators are not eternal, no matter how loudly they shout, how many billions they steal, or how many guns they point at their people. They fall. Some flee into exile, some rot in foreign prisons, some die like rats in pipes, and some are politely escorted out by their own comrades. But they always fall. And yet, the bigger tragedy is that when the dust settles, the system often remains. The same greed, the same elites, and the same cycle dressed in fresh costumes. For Africans, these downfalls are both cathartic and tragic because each removal comes after decades of suffering. For the diaspora, they are painful reminders of what home could have been without thieves at the helm. For Americans and Europeans, they are cautionary tales wrapped in hypocrisy because for every dictator they condemn, there was a time when they funded, armed, and shielded him. And so, the curtain falls again and again. Dictators go, the people endure, the struggle continues. History may rhyme, but one day it will sing a new song. Until then, welcome to Africa's theater of power, where no tyrant, no matter how feared, can cheat time forever.